History is often written by the victors, but the most important chapters are frequently written by those who were silenced. We are taught to view famine as a tragic inevitability, an act of God, or a failure of weather. But in the early 20th century, one man dared to look at a starving world and see not a curse, but a puzzle, a genetic code waiting to be cracked. While his contemporaries argued over politics and borders, Nikolai Vavilov argued with nature itself. He didn't just want to feed Russia, he wanted to end hunger as a concept for the entire human race. Today, we marvel at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in the icy heart of the Arctic, calling it the Doomsday Vault. We forget that the blueprint for this salvation wasn't drawn in the 21st century. It was forged 80 years earlier by a man who would eventually be erased from the very history books he helped to write. Vavilov was the Indiana Jones of botany, though his treasure was far more valuable than gold idols. He understood that the crops we rely on, wheat, corn, rice, were vulnerable. A single disease could wipe out a harvest and topple a civilization. To prevent this, he needed the original blueprints of nature. He needed the wild ancestors of our domestic crops. And so he ran. He ran across 5 continents, venturing into places where few outsiders dared to tread. He climbed the jagged peaks of the Andes to find the ancient mothers of the potato. He navigated the rugged terrain of Afghanistan and the highlands of Ethiopia, hunting for the resilient genetic strains of wheat and barley that had survived for millennia. He visited 64 countries, learning languages on the fly, sleeping in tents, and dodging bandits, driven by a singular, obsessive vision. Back in Leningrad, inside the thick walls of the All-Union Institute of Plant Industry, he began to assemble his Noah's Ark. But unlike the biblical vessel, this ark wasn't for animals, it was for the green blood of the earth. By the late 1930s, Vavilov had amassed the world's largest collection of plant seeds, over 250,000 samples. It was a library of life. If a blight destroyed the wheat fields of Ukraine, Vavilov could pull a drought-resistant strain from Ethiopia off a shelf in Leningrad and breed a survivor. He was building an insurance policy for humanity. His office was a whirlwind of maps, dried specimens, and frantic telegrams. To his students, he was a giant, a man who could see the future of agriculture. But to the eyes watching from the shadows of the Kremlin, this brilliant cosmopolitan scientist who corresponded with geneticists in London and New York was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming a suspect. In a regime that demanded total conformity, brilliance was dangerous, and Nikolai Vavilov was shining too brightly. While Vavilov was meticulously cataloging the genetic diversity of the planet, a dark reflection was rising from the soil of Soviet ideology. Enter Trofim Lysenko. If Vavilov was the embodiment of rigorous evidentiary science, Lysenko was the embodiment of a politically convenient fairy tale. A barefoot peasant turned agronomist, Lysenko didn't burden himself with the complex laws of genetics or the slow, painstaking process of selective breeding. He offered Stalin a seductive lie, that nature, like the Soviet citizen, could be re-educated. Lysenko claimed that if you simply froze grain seeds, they would learn to grow in winter, a process he called vernalization. He rejected the existence of genes entirely, calling them a bourgeois invention and a tool of Western imperialism. It was a clash between the hard truth of biology and the fantasy of totalitarian will. Stalin, a man who believed he could bend reality to his desires, was enchanted. Lysenko promised record-breaking harvests immediately, without the years of research Vavilov said were necessary. The Soviet Union was hungry, desperate, and impatient. Lysenko's empty promises tasted better than Vavilov's hard facts. The archives reveal a sickening shift in the atmosphere. The scientific debates in lecture halls were replaced by denunciations in the press. Vavilov, the president of the Academy of Agricultural Sciences, found himself fighting a war not against famine, but against ignorance weaponized by the state. He refused to bend. In one of his final, defiant public appearances, Vavilov stood before a hostile crowd and declared, "We shall go into the pyre, we shall burn, but we shall not retreat from our convictions." He knew the cost of truth was rising. The noose tightened slowly. First, his travel was restricted. Then his funding was cut. Finally, his colleagues began to disappear in the night. The man who collected the world was now trapped. On August 6, 1940, while on an expedition in western Ukraine, still working, still gathering samples, a black car pulled up. Agents of the NKVD stepped out. There was no trial, only a sentence. The man who held the keys to agricultural abundance was thrown into the bowels of the Butyrka prison. His life's work, the salvation of millions, was dismissed as wrecking and pseudoscience by a regime that chose to starve rather than admit it was wrong.
The irony of Nikolai Vavilov's fate is so cruel it feels like the script of a dark Greek tragedy. The man who had dedicated every waking moment of his life to ensuring that no human being would ever have to die of hunger was now slowly starving to death. Confined to a windowless, freezing cell in Saratov prison, Vavilov wasted away. He was fed a slurry of frozen cabbage and moldy flour, his body consuming itself, while his mind likely replayed the lush fields of Ethiopia and the terraced gardens of Peru. He died of starvation on January 26, 1943, and was dumped into an unmarked mass grave. The state had killed its greatest provider. But while Vavilov lay dying, a miracle of loyalty was unfolding in Leningrad. The German army had encircled the city, beginning the infamous Siege of Leningrad. For 900 days, the city was cut off. People were eating wallpaper paste, leather belts, and boiled shoe leather to survive. Inside the Institute of Plant Industry, Vavilov's collection, tons of edible rice, wheat, corn, and potatoes, sat unguarded against the gnawing hunger of the scientists who protected it. These men and women, Vavilov's loyal disciples, knew exactly what they were guarding. It wasn't just food, it was the genetic heritage of the planet. It was the future. They made a pact. They would not eat a single grain. They barricaded the windows against looters and took shifts guarding the vaults from rats and starving citizens. The cold was merciless. One by one, they began to succumb. Alexander Shtushkin, a peanut specialist, died at his writing desk, a packet of edible samples within arm's reach. Dmitry Ivanov, a rice specialist, died surrounded by thousands of bags of rice. In total, 9 scientists starved to death, surrounded by mountains of food. They valued the future of humanity more than their own lives. They understood what Stalin did not, that regimes fall, dictators die, but the seed remains. Today, 90% of the food we eat comes from the genetic varieties preserved in that building. Vavilov was erased, his name scraped off institute walls, but his arc survived. He won. The dictator starved the man, but he could not starve the idea.